Hello chess fans, today's video features an amazing game between the great world champion Emanuel Lasker, although this game was played before he was world champion, and the attacking player Jacques Mieses. Now in this position, I think Lasker could have finished off a fantastic game in a way that would have made the game truly immortal, but let's back up for now and see how the game began. Lasker opened the game with d4 and Mieses responded with f5, the Dutch defense. Now, the Dutch, something I play, is a little bit edgy, but it's really this move here, c5 on move 2, that is extremely edgy from Mieses. Now, this is something that is going too far, but we only know that a move like this is going too far because great players like Lasker and Mieses blazed the trail and proved that these things don't really work out that well. So in this position, White actually has a lot of good choices. Lasker picked a good option, but even stronger than what he played was d5 and e3. The general problem with c5 and f5 is that you're weakening a whole range of colors in the position. You're weakening the light squares and the dark squares in a way that just does not cohere in the position, and that's going to lead to a lot of problems. You're going to see that especially the light squares in this game are going to become a huge headache for Mieses. Interestingly, in my last tournament just a couple of weeks ago, I had an opponent who did this as White. They played one f4, the bird defense, which is, or the bird attack, which is like a reverse Dutch, and then they played c4 very soon after, and I actually won in 19 moves against a national master. So after c5 here, Lasker did decide to take on c5, which is a good idea, but there is a decent response here. That response would be pawn to e6 in this position, when recapturing with the bishop on c5 actually gives Black a pretty tenable position. Now, White's a little bit better, but this is totally playable, which is why d5 or e3 were better. Instead, Mieses responded with queen a5 check, a different way to get the pawn back, and this is classically wrong. When we're starting out in chess, we all learn you don't bring the queen out too early because you're going to lose time. The opponent is going to develop their minor pieces, maybe their pawns. They're going to attack that queen and you're going to run around. That's exactly what happens here. This is a great instructional example. You get knight c3 here. The queen does take back on c5, and Lasker picks the most incisive move, pawn to e4, striking in the center, ripping away the f5 pawn will expose the light squares as an even greater weakness, and this is going to allow for rapid development and future tempos on the queen. Now, Mieses takes on e4 here. We get knight takes e4, which hits the queen. Some of you might want to play the move instead of queen e7 played in the game, queen e5 right here. Now, if you play queen e5, it looks nice. I'm threatening to take the knight. I'm pinning the knight to the king, but this is another example of how if you keep your queen in the middle, you're going to lose more time. This is a worse move than what Mieses played because bishop d3 develops another piece, defends the knight, and you're going to get hit with knight f3, gaining more time on the queen. Now, after the move queen c7 instead, correctly pulling the queen back, I think we get a nice move here, knight to h3. This is intending to bring the knight around here, which will poke at the light squares further here, thinking about things like queen h5 check, and the knight might jump into d5. In fact, this recalls the miniature from Sokolsky that we looked at recently on the channel. Check out the card that I'm popping up right now to see that really wonderful miniature. Now, after knight h3, we get pawn to g6, probably developing the knight was better, and we get knight to f4, looking at this d5 square, bishop to g7, developing the bishop, knight d5, hitting the queen. The queen falls back to d8, and then a good move was actually bishop f4 when you're threatening a fork here, so the most natural move would seem to be d6, but then c5 is ripping things open, and White is doing stupendously. Lasker's move is also good. He plays bishop to g5, which is thinking about hopping this knight into d6. Now, Mieses doesn't have a really good response, so he plays the greediest move. I can sympathize with this as a chess coach. You don't want to encourage your students to be greedy, but still it's better to take a pawn and suffer than to not take a pawn and still suffer. So he goes ahead and plays bishop takes b2. The knight does hop into d6 with check because the bishop is on g5. We have a pin, so the king needs to move over to f8. It's obviously not happy here. The queen comes to f3, tickling it further, and now bishop f6 falling back here. Now, there are a lot of good ways to continue here. One way that the computer likes is castling queenside in this position. This is not the most practical decision at all, but it reminds me of the great game Dubov versus Geary that we also looked at on the channel. I'll pop up another card for that. And I just love pointing out a really wild castling move here. So this is another strong way to play, but I think it's definitely not the most practical decision, and Lasker finds a really good, strong, and practical decision. He trades on f6, and after knight takes, he trades here, and he just drops his queen into d5. These two pieces right here, which are the only two pieces that are developed in the position because the queen has fallen back to her starting square over here, are really just strangling the black position. They control all of the important parts of the board, which are the center, and they radiate their influence into the king side as well. So they're just dominating all the critical squares. After this, because there is a mate threatened here on f7, we get queen e7 check, and no worries about the king. The king steps to d2. Black is in no position to trouble the king, so it is happy to be in the center of the board here. Getting your pieces out is a priority. This is a very nice move. I can see that a lot of beginner players might play bishop e2 here. They don't want to lose the right to castle, but this is an opportunity. We need to bring in more pieces into the attack, and king d2 is looking to do that with the great move rook to e1. So king d2 much better than bishop e2 in this position. After king d2, king to g7 makes sense. Don't have a lot of good choices. Either way, white's coming to the e-file with rook e1 as in the game. The queen does not have good squares to go to. She falls back to the f8 square. This is a good point to pause your video, I think, and try and figure out how you would continue if you were Lasker in this position. It's obvious that the position is amazing for white, but what is the strongest continuation? Now, good is rook e8. That is going to win the black queen, but after black gives up the queen, then you still have to kind of find a way through. Basically, white's pieces are so good that winning the queen here seems like settling, and we don't want to settle. A much nicer move, one that Lasker played, is pawn to h4 here. After pawn to h4, we're simply threatening h5 and h6, and we're including this rook, which is one of the few pieces not participating in the position. Black was justifiably scared of h5, h6, so black played h5. And then another great move, very instructive, rook h3, a rook lift. We recently had a great article on chess.com about how Paul Morphy invented the rook lift. I'm not entirely sure that's true, but I don't have the ability to go back and disprove that and find an earlier rook lift. Certainly the example given by Morphy in the article is one of the earliest rook lifts, but here's another good early example of a rook lift. The rook is swinging up. It could possibly go over here, but most likely it's going to the e3 square so that it can double. And that is just going to be huge. The control over the e-file is monstrous for white here. So rook h3, very nice. Knight c6, and then rook to e3, doubling. Queen d8. Black has the idea here of playing queen to a5 check and trading queens, but that's really not going to save black. And in this position, Lasker did finish off the game, but he also missed the way to finish off this really wonderful, instructive game in a way that would have made this game really immortal, would have made it one of his best games, would have made it one that I think everyone would have seen, whereas now I think this game, though great, is probably one that very few of you have seen. I'd encourage you to pause your video and try to find a forced checkmate in 6 for white. So the forced checkmate in 6 that Lasker did not play here is queen to f7 to start. So this check pushes the king to h6, and it might not look like the queen's actually doing a lot over here, although there are a lot of good attacking moves in this position. The checks from black don't mean a lot, but the finisher is queen takes g6, check, a beautiful queen sacrifice. I know these things can just seem flashy, right? There's lots of ways to win, but come on, we chess players love a queen sacrifice like this. This is the perfect culmination, the perfect cherry on top to the great strategic attacking play we've seen earlier. After king takes g6, the rook goes to g3. The knight is perfectly situated on d6, covering the king's attempts to flee to the f file. So the king steps back. If the king steps back to h6, then knight f5 check pushes the king into this beautiful mating alignment right here. So the king is going to try instead to step to h7, but the bishop lunges in. If you push this pawn right here, then you just take it, nothing changes. So the king steps up and knight to f7 and checkmate. What a beautiful finish this would have been. Now, ultimately, Lasker actually played the move rook to e8 in this position. This wins a piece after black traded and then went for queen a5 check, trading queens. You simply win a piece on c8, win the game, and this was, another 12 moves down the road that Mieses resigned, but the game is totally over here. So this was a clean, convincing win for Lasker, but it also made me think about the fact that Lasker, why do we not see more of his games? And I think it's because he was a pragmatic player. You see that here. He's going to go and grab the win. He sees a clean win. He's going to take it. He's not going to be looking for that queen sacrifice. In that sense, he's a lot like Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen recently gave an interview where he talked about making the prosaic winning decision.
Yeah, I thought after rook e1 I was completely winning, but then I chose a really prosaic way with with this knight h4, and I think after g5 knight g6 actually wins, like rook f6, rook e8, king g7. I think I can go knight h8. I'm just probably winning, but I thought there is no need, since what I play is also completely dominating, and it should win easily.
Now, in that interview, you see Magnus saying, well, I could have done some really cool things and they might have won, but this looked convincing enough and I played that. I think Lasker and Magnus are actually possibly the most alike in some ways of the world champions that are out there. You see that here, they play in different styles, but it's all about getting the win. They're not the kind of players who look to create flashy combinations. And that's why they, I think, dominated chess in their era, but you also don't see nearly as many brilliant games as you do from Alekhine and Tal, where these players were trying to find that perfect finish, that perfect cherry on top at the end of their games. In any case, if you enjoyed this game, then I do have more great games from Lasker. You can click on the playlist sitting on top of the board. And as always, if you like the content, then you can subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos.